do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion. It can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to the 4th episode of Murderocracy, the podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Sami Shah.
Hey Sammy, how you going? Did you get booted off any podcasts this week?
It's really weird. I was going to be talking to Jessica Rowe about my love life and all the relationships I have, and then all these these social identity politics warriors said that it was the wrong thing for her to do to put me on, and so I don't know. I was going on in my persona as Pauline Hanson. I sometimes cosplay as a right-wing politician, so I think maybe that's what went wrong.
Cancel culture claims yet another life. Oh, man.
At this point, cancel culture claims more lives than COVID does.
We need to get to a cancel culture zero policy. Suppression isn't enough. We have to eliminate it.
Yes, exactly. We need a cancel culture vaccine is what we do need.
This week, we're going to be talking to Geoff Dembicki. He is a US-based investigative climate reporter who we actually mentioned his work briefly last week about how News Corp executives had been doing one thing on climate change while their top personalities had been saying another. We'll get into that.
Shocking and awing, yes.
And some pretty interesting stuff that came out of it in terms of what this means about how the company works, some of the potential rifts in the family. So it's a great chat. But first, we're going to get on to the News Corp news of the week.
All right, let's do this.
In research on Australian news websites about their disinformation risk, news.com.au has come out as one of the websites with the lowest risk. The Global Disinformation Index looked at 34 Australian news websites and found that news.com.au came out second after SBS and before the ABC, and also in the top 10 were the Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, and the Daily Telegraph, all from News Corp. Steve Jones from Mumbrella, who wrote this up, said, "These publications, according to the researchers, performed almost perfectly on content. Most articles are neutral and unbiased, carry bylines and headlines which match the story's contents, and do not negatively target groups or individuals." Sammy, does this result surprise you?
Look, I'm going to admit, yes, it does. But at the same time, it also made me question certain base assumptions. You have that conversation with people sometimes who say the ABC is a left-wing news organization. And you go, well, yes, but every time we've done independent investigations into the ABC's, any bias within the ABC, we've found time and time again that the ABC has proven its unbiased nature. Maybe the idea that News Corp publications are right-wing bias or source of disinformation has become such a completely believed truth without any actual analysis that this is shocking. Or maybe it's the fact that this organization that did the research, which is Queensland University of Technology's Global Disinformation Index, comes out of Queensland and automatically is idiotic. I don't know. Look, as you know, I have a famous dislike of the state of Queensland. I'm kidding.
For opposition and balance sake, I love the people of Queensland. We value your listenership very much. I would like to dig down into this a little bit more, but I do think that this kind of reminds us that there are many parts of News Corp that do legitimately good work, and out of all of them, news.com.au, which is one of Australia's most read news websites,
yes,
is a lot more hardline on things like climate change. It definitely does have some of the tabloidy aspects of it, some of the celeb stuff, etc. But that's not really the kind of super harmful and hardcore stuff. And I did notice that the Australian wasn't in the top most reputable, or I guess least at risk of having disinformation. But yeah, I think it does. I think you're right. Kind of, let's temper somewhat our kind of takes on them. That, there are plenty of bad takes, but on the whole, they are doing good work.
I think the difference here is people forget quite often that the opinion column or the opinion section of a newspaper is not the entire newspaper. And the stuff that ends up going viral, the stuff that ends up being read the most and causes the most fury and outrage tends to be the opinion section. So if you pick up the Herald Sun, yes, Andrew Bolt's column is in there, but largely the Herald Sun is reporting on press conferences, on public events, on just, news reports, things like that. Yes, they might have the front page will have a salacious headline, but majority of the pages of the Herald Sun will just be your average, what's going on in a metro newspaper kind of stories. But that's not what people remember. They remember Andrew Bolt's column. And so this is a good reminder that, the newspaper is not the opinion column and the opinion column is not the newspaper. There's just a tiny portion of a newspaper or a magazine or a news channel.
Yeah, that's true. But my question is, do most people know that? And does that kind of artificial separation actually work in reality? Because, you see, for instance, when most people see something from the Daily Telegraph, which has a lot of opinion writers and a lot of news writers, there's no distinction in your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed when something's opinion. Both look very similar. They're both from dailytelegraph.com.au. Often the headlines can be quite similar as well. So when you see something, you see something presented as a kind of balanced news article that looks identical to what a, by its nature, an unbalanced opinion article is, and vice versa. The idea that there's kind of a separation, that used to happen when you had, when people used to, I know they still do, but mostly used to use physical newspapers where your opinion was separated from your news.
Yes.
That just doesn't happen anymore.
Exactly.
In how people actually consume it.
Well, there was I'm going to get a bit unnecessarily academic here, but
when
I was studying in university, we were studying postmodernism, and one of the big highlights of postmodern developmental in thought and postmodern thought was the moment when Life magazine and these kind of magazines in the 50s and 60s started doing things like they'd have a page, a series of photographs of major works of art. And they'd have one page where they'd have a Picasso, and right next to it would be a picture of, Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which is a urinal turned upside down. And the idea that you could place in a gallery, these two pieces would be in separate sections. But in a magazine, there's two pages pressed right next to each other, which places them on the same level, became a major controversial thing in terms of intellectual thought and stuff like that. And I think we're seeing the same thing now with social media, or not social media, but online news sourcing. When you go to Facebook, you're as likely to see a headline from a journalist, who's written a well-researched article about a certain subject, using sources, using all of the tools that a good journalist has at hand. And you're also going to see an opinion column from an editorial columnist, or just from a celebrity columnist or someone like that, with no journalistic integrity behind it, with no journalistic ethos behind it, and no journalistic requirements for it to be factual. And they're presented to you in the same Facebook feed. And like you said, they're both coming from heraldsun.com.au or telegraph.com.au. And so in our brains, we don't make the distinction anymore, that one is opinion and one is journalism. We see them both as journalism. And therefore, I think we judge it wrongly. And something like this, the research by the Global Disinformation Index, is a good reminder that the things we think are biased are not as biased as we think they are.
Yeah. The one thing that I also kind of wanted to mention in that is, when you peel back the curtain of how news organizations work, there is a drive for attention and for clicks. That's true. Not at the cost of everything, as sometimes people say, oh, they're just writing a news article to get clicks. Well, no, sometimes it's just, a news thing. But opinion really is kind of essential to the business model of a lot of online journalism for two reasons. Mm-hmm. One, it gets reaction. People say, when you say something controversial or when you take an opinion on something, that's something that people care about, they click about, they share. But the other thing is that opinion is very easy to produce. You don't need to do an investigation. You don't need to, put the hours into, being a journalist who hits the sidewalks or who's pulling documents or doing all this other work. You can just make something up. That's what an opinion is. Very often it's like, I saw this and I think this. That kind of, high results but low, not very resource intensive, part of the company, in the end, actually ends up subsidizing some of the other work.
Yes.
But it is kind of, and so that's why we do it. But but I do think that we have this inherent tension where if people are seeing them as the same thing, and I know people at the end of the day, most people I do think understand the difference between news and opinion, but they do think that opinions kind of represent the paper in some kind of way. I do actually think that that if we were really, as the media, really concerned about, trying to be above reproach or trying to be reputable, we would actually separate them out more. We would actually not have them in the same publication. But because it is such a core part of the business model, we just need to keep on doing it. And I think ultimately that kind of hurts the credibility of journalism.
It'll be interesting to see whether, we will get to a place where papers will make that distinction by splitting up the two sections more, but I'm not holding my breath.
So on to the next topic. News Corp is doing pretty well, and that money is burning a hole in its pocket. The AFL's Miranda Waugh reports that News Corp CEO Robert Thomson, an Australian, is keeping an eye out for any media companies to purchase, as they announced they were spending $1 billion buying back shares. Thomson said, "We will be opportunistic, as we have been when the right sort of company comes up at the right sort of price." So they're looking to expand. There are a few other interesting tidbits in this announcement. News Corp's James Madden reports on, this is pretty interesting, the details of the agreement between News Corp, and this is the US News Corp, and the Murdoch Family Trust. He said, under the agreement, News Corp and the Family Trust must avoid actions that would give the Trust and Murdoch family members more than 44% of the voting power of the company's Class B stock. The Trust's voting power must also not increase by more than 1.75% in any 12-month rolling period. Essentially, what that all means is that they're making sure that the Murdoch family can't have complete control of the company, which I found very interesting. And the final thing that came out of this was, Robert Thomson also said that Australian digital publications for News Corp in particular are doing pretty well. He said, "We saw a 25% increase in digital subscribers at the mastheads in the fourth quarter, while there was a healthy recovery in advertising. Clearly, businesses are subject to the vagaries of the virus in Australia, but the robust recovery in recent months is a hopeful harbinger." So, Sammy, to me, it sounds like business is booming.
Business is booming, and if they're looking for stuff to buy, I mean, one option is they could maybe buy a whole bunch of these, the regional newspapers that they shut down and maybe reopen those. They've got the money now, clearly. Another option is, I don't know if they're looking to buy any podcasts, but there's a really good podcast that looks into News Corp that I can recommend. Maybe a few $1 billion, and we might be willing to negotiate.
Totally. Look, everyone has a price, and my price for becoming a unashamedly pro Murdoch podcast is surprisingly low.
Oh, it's shockingly low. I assure you that they would be embarrassed for me. It's how low that would be. But look, I don't know. We're living in a time now where press conferences, premiers, state premiers' press conferences get the kind of viewer rating numbers that reality TV shows used to envy. So it's no surprise that, all news channels are doing well. All newspapers are doing well. People are news obsessed at this point, and the fact that News Corp is benefiting from that is not really surprising at all. The thing that's interesting is the part where the limited control of the Murdoch Family Trust within News Corp. It kind of goes back to something that a lot of News Corp editors have said in the past, which is, Rupert Murdoch does not have direct editorial oversight of our content. And sometimes, having lived in a dictatorship, I can tell you, the dictator does not have direct, oversight over everything that happens in the country. Sometimes, people just behave according to what they think will be the whims and the wishes of the dictator without actually consulting him. And I think something like that is what takes place here. The limited control of Murdoch Family Trust over the publications means that people are just doing stuff that they think he'll like versus things that he might actually tell them to do.
Yeah, you don't need 50% or more to control what the company does. They are taking notes.
Exactly.
So we mentioned this just before, but when Jessica Rowe took down her podcast with Pauline Hanson this week, many people saw it as a win for the power of speech. You know, it's people debating who is allowed to have a platform. This is actually the proof that, you know, freedom of speech is working. It's the marketplace of ideas. That's what some people thought, but that wasn't what you saw on the pages of News Corp publications. Amanda Mead reported in The Guardian that in an editorial headline, "The mob wins yet again," the Daily Telegraph praised Hanson as humane. Hanson didn't add to Rowe's stress. "While I'm disappointed that Jess succumbed," she said yesterday, "I understand why she pulled the episode. The most humane person in this episode was the target." And Chris Kennedy went off on Sky News as well, calling it cancel culture. Sammy, to you, is this cancel culture in action?
Man, what isn't cancel culture in action these days? Here's the... Okay. All right, so I'm gonna be very honest here. I'm gonna be very honest here, right? I'm gonna tell you what I think about this. I want to know what you think about this before we get into whether or not the media coverage of it is fair. I think in the end, Jessica Rowe, who is a person I'm not that familiar with, right? I didn't grow up in Australia, so I had to personally Google her to find out. And I think she runs a podcast. This is not a mainstream media outlet. This isn't a TV channel. It isn't a newspaper article or something like that. It's a podcast, and it's by, yes, it's funded by Austereo, but still, at the end of the day, podcasts are opt-in things. The first episode of the podcast is Carl Stefanovic. Anyone who's listening to a podcast about Carl Stefanovic's hopes and dreams is anyway a loser. Like, I don't care, who you are. Like, why on earth would you put that in your stupid ears? The thing is, if she wants to interview Pauline Hanson, fine. That's her choice, and it is her podcast. If you don't like it, if you don't want it, don't listen to it. Now, yes, there's a whole argument to be made about normalizing Pauline Hanson. Guess what? Pauline Hanson's a parliamentarian. She's been a parliamentarian for a very long time. She's also been on Dancing with the Stars. She's also on all the TV channels. She was normalized ages ago. That's a battle we lost. Forget about that, right? So at this point, the targeting of a person who also very publicly has talked about her mental health issues, which Jessica Rowe, it seems, has been a very vocal mental health advocate, has talked about her own struggles with depression and stuff. The way the people kind of went after her, I thought was short-sighted, and I thought was extremely disappointing from a group of people who at this point should know better, because we know how media narratives go. We know exactly what would have happened once she took the podcast down, which is exactly what did happen once she took the podcast down. And I personally don't think she should have taken the podcast down. It was her podcast. She should have stood behind it and said, look, I made a decision when I put her on. She can maybe have been... I heard the episode, and it's very, very... complimentary to Pauline Hanson, and it does sound, there's a mild criticism of Pauline Hanson's policies at the start, but Jessica Rowe, it seems, as overall doesn't seem Pauline Hanson as too problematic, and maybe that reveals more about Jessica Rowe than Jessica Rowe would have thought it revealed, etc. But this backlash, this whole thing of Pauline Hanson now is the victim, all that, we knew this would happen. We knew this is the way the direction goes. Maybe it's time to start thinking of a different way of having these conversations than this boring, completely going down the same path with exactly the same results every time approach.
I have a completely different opinion. I really, really strongly disagree with that view. And the reason is because, so you mentioned how Pauline Hanson has been normalized. Mm-hmm. That's true. She's been on a lot of mainstream television. She was on Today's Show and Sunrise for years and years and years. Yes. But she's actually not as much now. In fact, she was kicked off Nine's Today Show when she made disparaging comments about the people in the Melbourne Housing Commission towers that were locked down in the pandemic last year. She called them, I think, alcoholics and drug addicts. Mm-hmm. She was kicked off after there was a backlash. That actually, to her, is a big loss. That's a big loss of an audience who is significant and also probably not exposed to her views otherwise, or may not be super politically engaged. Mm-hmm. For her, that's a big loss. She's running out of mainstream places to be on air. And although she may be normalized in the past, attitudes are changing. People are becoming more critical about who media chooses to platform. And here's the thing. Pauline Hanson isn't going away. like she by kicking off the podcast, she is not going to not be in Parliament anymore. But she doesn't have the right to be in a podcast. And when people speak up and say, Jessica Rowe, on your podcast, which is featured, Carl Stefanovic, Sophie Monk, like all these other softball guests, when you bring on someone like Pauline Hanson and give her the most super sympathetic interview where you talk to her about love, about raising kids, where you don't actually mention any of the consequences of her action as a public figure, what you do is allow her to be a sympathetic character, and you cut out the actual influence of her actions, which is that she has spent 2 decades vilifying and being and making life difficult for many Australians.
Yes.
And I'm not going to call them, people of colour. I'm not going to say immigrants, because they're just Australians.
Yes.
She has made their life hell. I don't need to tell you that. You, of course, know that. But what we're seeing is people are more critical about who can be on air now. And they're saying, look, hey, Jessica Rowe, if you want to have her an interview, they're not saying you can't. The criticism was the type of interview and what you got out of her. Pauline Hanson has done a million softball interviews. She used to always be in, those women's magazines, like you said before. She was on Dancing with the Stars. We know just about everything there is to know about Pauline Hanson. This interview didn't tread any new ground. If there really was an interview that was like important, that kind of, shone a new light on her or held her to account, I'm sure Jessica Rowe, as an established journalist, would have stood up behind it and said, yes, I'm actually proud of this. But she didn't. She really didn't have anything to justify why she was giving a softball interview. And when she took it down, ultimately, it was a business decision. She saw that people were like, this sucks. You're giving a free kick to someone who doesn't deserve a free kick. She could have kept it up. This is actually, to me, free speech in action. And I think here's why I think it's ultimately good. One, it sends a message that, people don't want to see interviews like this with people that are uncritical, that give them, airtime without calling them on their response. That's probably a good thing. We demand more from our people. The second thing is, the criticism of people saying, oh, look, we get this media cycle of she gets invited on, then the podcast gets taken down, and then Pauline Hanson is a victim of cancel culture. The problem there, the people who cause that are not the people who spoke up and said that Pauline Hanson has caused me, my family, my people, other people I know, anguish, they've hurt them, they've made my life harder.
Right.
The person responsible for that is Jessica Rowe. And so I'm not personally, I don't blame the people who stood up and said, I find her views unacceptable, and I think the fact that you did this interview, which was a softball interview, I think that's bad and you should take it down. I don't think they're responsible for that following media cycle. That falls completely on Jessica Rowe, an experienced journalist who's been in the game a long time. She should know better, and she's ultimately responsible for that happening.
Well, so look, there's you can be cynical and say that Jessica Rowe did this on purpose to get the numbers, or her producers came up with the idea, and regardless of the end result, she's benefited, right? There's also the idea that, if for I'll give you an example, is that I didn't know about her podcast. I didn't know who she even was until this whole story kind of came out. And I think most people did not know her podcast even existed until this story came out. So I think that right there kind of shows you a little bit about sometimes drawing attention to something to damn it and to condemn it does promote it more. And there might be some, cynical approach to this might be to say that, yes, they're on purpose entirely. I don't know. I just feel like at this point, the people who aren't, I'm not talking about people on social media, for example, who are vocal about this stuff. I'm not talking about people in traditional media who are vocal about this stuff in the opposite direction. I'm talking about the average person, who is watching all of this from afar, who isn't a media personality. And I think you're going to find more of them tend to believe, particularly, non-white white Australians, etc., might end up believing that this is an example of cancel culture gone crazy or censorship than something as nuanced as what you've described. And I think, you end up in that situation losing people who might otherwise have been on the right side of the argument because of a reaction to something that lacked nuance. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like the way that this is kind of played out, I was a bit disappointed by how traditional all of it was, and we can see that, like you said, with the response on News Corp, with the response and left versus right media, etc., and all the columns that were written about it. The question is now, what happens? Who does Pauline Hanson capitalize on this and thus use it to get more attention than if she had just had the podcast go up and no one would have cared?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I mean, I still just think that, like, there are people out there who already believe cancel cultures run amok. Mm-hmm. There are already the people who are, watching Chris Kenny every night. And by the way, if Chris Kenny didn't talk about Pauline Hanson, he'd talk about, I don't know, cheese being renamed.
Right,
that's
exactly.
Cancel culture. Yeah. Like they would always find something to be angry and upset about. Mm-hmm. Then there's the people who already know that they don't like Pauline Hanson, that they find her views unacceptable. There are a lot of people in the middle who might actually be shaped and influenced by the decision, being like, oh, people are calling that unacceptable, and actually, yeah, it kind of is. So I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit more optimistic. maybe I'm being naive, but I do think that there is a positive effect of saying, this person who has said the most awful things about Asians, about Muslims, I don't think, despite the fact that they're, in Parliament, I don't think that they are someone who I want to platform on a fairly, I mean, Jessica Rowe's podcast isn't huge, but you'd say it's pretty, like, she's a professional journalist who's been in mainstream media for years. It's about as establishment as you can get. The fact that she was ultimately rejected from something like that, I think sends a message about how modern society, how normal and mainstream Australians are becoming less likely to accept views like that. It sends a signal.
All right. Well, yeah. Look, we clearly agree to disagree, but yes, I will say that the media reaction, though, I think we can both agree is fairly straightforward and standard and expected. Those are, there's a macro that you can work into MS Word at this point. You just press Control F3 and it'll write the Pauline Hanson was cancelled and that was cancel culture. Go on a mock article for you.
And now for our new segment, Good News Corp, Bad News Corp, where we look at the best takes, the worst takes of the week, because we want to celebrate when they do well and give them a little kick when they don't. Mm-hmm. Sammy, this week you had a nominee for what you really liked.
Indeed. I watched the resignation of Gladys Berejiklian with the same kind of slack-jawed shock as everybody else did. Friday seemed to have escalated as a news day really suddenly. And the one thing that I found very disappointing across the board, and this isn't just a criticism of News Corp, it's a criticism of the ABC as well, it's a criticism of most mainstream news, was the lamentations and the outpouring of grief for the loss of a premier of such great quality and standard, and the kind of hashtag girl boss approach to all of this. And it seemed as though, honestly, looking at some media commentators talking, you'd think that, Gladys Berejiklian has died tragically in a plane crash, as opposed to the fact that Gladys Berejiklian has just resigned because of an ICAC investigation. So it was refreshing to see Shannon Malloy write an article for news.com.au, which the headline is Gladys Berejiklian is popular and well-liked, so her resignation is sad, but don't cry for her. And basically Malloy's point in this entire thing is, look, ICACs don't do this willy-nilly. They're very, his exact quote is, its decisions are precise, clinical really, and made only after meticulous examination of the facts. And the fact that Gladys Berejiklian hadn't resigned already, in the past, when this first became an issue between her and Darren Maguire, shows that she is not a victim. In fact, stayed in a job way longer than she should have. And this isn't a mob behavior, but actually is responsible political oversight. And so I thought it was really refreshing to see an article like that coming, not from the ABC website, not from, The Guardian or something like that, but from the News Corp and news.com.au in particular, where it was well-reasoned, well-argued, and very well, respectful of ICAC and its role.
Yeah, good on you, Shannon. I thought it was fair and good as well. Now, on the flip side of the Gladys coverage...
Well, there has to be balance, right?
Of course. You have to represent all voices. And this voice was a lot more critical of what happened yesterday. It is from The Australian, and it was an article by Yoni Bashan, who is the New South Wales political correspondent. And the headline is, Curse of ICAC claims COVID crusader Gladys.
That is some classy alliteration right there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, maybe they just did it for the alliteration. But the article really centers Gladys's her gripe that this investigation came at a really bad time for the state and, of course, her, which I just found to be a bit of a trash take. And it kind of sums up that view that we've seen from a few people being like, well, like, you know, it's just an allegation and she's been such a good premier otherwise. And, you know, where the state is in a really tough moment. That, you know, that's all true. You know, people think she's done a good job. It obviously is a tough time for New South Wales. But to blame this, you know, essentially to point the finger at ICAC, the body that's supposed to investigate corruption, that's supposed to point out when politicians aren't being public servants, but actually, you know, using their powers to benefit themselves and people in their lives. Mm-hmm. That's what they should be doing. Like, they should be investigating people like this, no matter when it happens. That, you know, there's never really a good time to have alleged corruption investigated if you are someone who's being accused. And to center this concern that you know, essentially being like, Gladys is very hard done by. I just find the whole response to this bizarre. I know New South Wales state politics has been a bit of a shit show, and I know there's been a lot of corruption, and I know that a lot of people are happy with the way that Gladys has dealt with COVID in the state. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's pretty much like, you know, if you are if this accusation turns out to be true, even if you've just done a little bit of corruption and the rest of you's been really good, it's a bit of a no-starter for me.
Look, I come from a country which is basically in the World Corruption Index, was always in the top 3 spots. You know, Pakistan is notorious for the level of corruption. And I can guarantee you a little bit of corruption is a massive gateway to a lot of corruption. And the fact that we are at the point in Australia where someone being held to account for their corruption is seen as a problem and a failure of the system because that person's popular is very much evidence of the rise of populist politics, the rise of populism, and a lack of oversight of corruption, which is probably the most damning thing politicians can do. This entire thing for me was alarm bells ringing. You know, I've always maintained people from developing countries can see the fault lines in developed countries a lot sooner because we know what happens when things go really bad. I can guarantee you my Geiger counter was ringing.
And now we're joined by Geoff Dembicki, who is an investigative climate reporter who has bylines in Vice and Rolling Stone, and just wrote an article that caught my eye called "Rupert Murdoch Has Known We've Been in a Climate Emergency Since 2006, Documents Show" for Vice. Geoff, welcome, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Geoff, first of all, before you found these documents, which are fascinating, what did you already know about News Corp's stance on the environment?
Well, it's pretty hard to avoid the media reporting that News Corp does on climate change. So obviously, being based here in New York, we're subjected to Fox News's coverage of climate change constantly, and there's also the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. And I knew from reporting on climate change that in Australia there was a lot of discussion over how media outlets like The Australian had covered those terrible bushfires that you had in 2020. So I was quite familiar with News Corp as pushing a particular type of, let's not mince words and just call it climate denial. But in approaching this story, I was just curious what some of the corporate thinking was behind some of those positions on climate change, and then that led me to some sort of strange and surprising places.
A lot of the information you found, which basically is information that points to the fact that News Corp, it turns out, is a lot more green as a corporation than you would assume it would be. Is publicly available data, right? It's publicly available filings and things like that. How is it that it took so long for someone to even pick up on this information that News Corp is a bit hypocritical in the way it covers these issues?
Yeah, it's weird, hey. And I had no idea that News Corp, as a corporation and internally, has been tracking its climate impact for over a dozen years, and in fact takes climate change very seriously. And I was only clued off to this because I saw this strange interview that Rupert Murdoch had done in 2007 with an environmental outlet in the US called Grist. And at the time, Rupert Murdoch had decided that, in fact, climate change was and is a very big deal. And he wanted to use the massive persuasive powers of his media empire to get ordinary people to change their behavior. And that included, at the time, he said he was going to approach some of the famous Fox News hosts like Sean Hannity and ask them if they would be interested in doing more climate change coverage. And I thought, like, how is this possible? This is like so contrary to absolutely like everything I know about News Corp media outlets. And so when I looked a bit closer, I discovered that starting around 2006 or so, News Corp had been filing these disclosures about its positions on climate change to a group called the Carbon Disclosure Project. And so basically every year News Corp had said, these are some of the risks we face from climate change. We've quantified them, and these are the things we're doing to make the company more sustainable. And so News Corp was just filing these things every year as its own outlets started to get more and more confrontational in their climate denial coverage. And I think the reason that nobody really reported on this stuff, even though it was all publicly available, is because these two different narratives about News Corp just don't seem compatible at all.
Can you lay out some of those contradictions that you found? Like, I mean, the article is filled with them. What were some of the more galling examples of contradictions between what you found in these public documents and what some of the company's top stars were saying on air or in print?
Yeah, well, one of the things that really jumped out to me at first was with how News Corp internally was talking about Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York in 2012, caused all sorts of damage, resulted in deaths. And so at the time, the Wall Street Journal was publishing opinion pieces saying it's irresponsible to make the link between climate change and Hurricane Sandy. Scientists just don't know, and we shouldn't be talking about these things. It just politicizes a tragedy. But then when I looked at the disclosures that News Corp had filed the following year, so in 2013, the company specifically refers to Hurricane Sandy as a climate-related disaster. And so that kind of shows you how the corporate side of things is thinking about climate change much differently than the side of News Corp that most people encounter. And this plays out across a whole number of events, including the Australian bushfires. So as those were happening, as you and your listeners will know, Murdoch-owned outlets were pushing this narrative that a lot of the fires were lit by arsonists or were somehow the fault of environmentalists or progressive politicians. But internally, News Corp considered those fires to be definitely related to climate change. And the company went as far to say in one of its disclosures that it was actually holding safety trainings for its employees to make sure that they weren't harmed in these types of extreme events.
One thing that I found particularly noteworthy in the kind of difference between the documents and their public facing stuff was the discussion around a carbon tax. In Australia, that was a highly contentious topic that was really fought out in politics, but of course on the front of News Corp publications. What did they say in their disclosures about this kind of policy?
Well, I mean, that part of it I found, particularly fascinating. And I don't claim to be an expert on Australian politics by any means. But it does seem clear that, at one point, your governments were very interested in putting a price on carbon pollution, and that Murdoch-owned outlets pushed very, very hard to make sure that didn't happen. And so I was quite surprised when I looked at some of News Corp's climate change disclosures around that time, because the company says in those disclosures that it actually considers a carbon price to be a very good and effective way of fighting climate change. And the company even stresses that in the US, it had actually advocated for this type of policy. It had worked with different public opinion researchers in order to find out an effective way of communicating the benefits of such a policy, and that in jurisdictions all over the world, News Corp thought that it was pretty likely that it would have to face some sort of carbon pricing in at least one of the countries it operated in. And so one of the reasons News Corp said in these documents that it was studying carbon pricing and taking its own climate risk more seriously was that if a carbon price were to come in a serious way, then News Corp would be in a better position than its competitors. And so the whole time it was attacking politicians in Australia over this, it actually considered that to be, good and worthwhile policy.
Geoff, what about the role that Rupert Murdoch's children have played in all of this and the company's position on climate change?
I mean, that's an interesting part of this story, and I don't have any special access to the Murdoch family or special knowledge of the dynamics in that family. But what I heard again and again when I was doing this story is that the reason Rupert Murdoch seemed to get suddenly interested in climate change starting around 2006, 2007, probably had a bit to do with his son, James Murdoch. And so at the time, people told me that, James was in favor with his father, and James was also becoming more and more interested in climate change and sustainability. And apparently a bit of that influence rubbed off on Rupert Murdoch. And in 2006, he held a meeting for News Corp executives and other people associated with the company at this fancy resort in California. And they actually had Al Gore come to that and do a presentation of his film, An Inconvenient Truth. And so people said at the time, that was likely due in part to James's influence on his dad. I mean, there were a whole bunch of other factors that go into that, but I think the family dynamic is significant here.
It's interesting you mentioned that part of the of the conference where they did the filming of Inconvenient Truth, because your article covers this, that an Australian leading commentator, Andrew Bolt, one of the jewels in the News Corp Australia crown, got up and essentially got into a Barney, as people allege, with Al Gore about it. From your perspective, you're in the US, and you've looked at this now. Do you almost see any difference between, I guess, the almost like the different arms or the different parts of News Corp based on countries? Because the thing that I kind of come back to in this is that Australia's commentators, the coverage of Australia, in climate change in Australia, seems to have even lagged behind, or has been even more, I guess, regressive than elsewhere.
Well, you need to watch some more Fox News.
Okay.
And I know Fox isn't explicitly owned by News Corp anymore, but it's still an important part of Murdoch's overall empire. And I think that the type of climate denial and obstructionism in terms of climate coverage that you guys are seeing in Australia is definitely comparable to what outlets like Fox News put out all the time. And an example of that I touch on in the story is that we had these terrible wildfires up and down the West Coast last year. And one of Fox News's top hosts, Tucker Carlson, did a segment basically ridiculing people for even suggesting that those fires could be linked to climate change. And he said, this is what the Democrats want you to believe. It's all part of their propaganda. But in fact, like the other examples I described, News Corp in those disclosures had called the wildfires potentially evidence of the physical impacts of climate change, and something that the company wanted to take seriously. And as head of Fox Corporation, Lachlan Murdoch had said in a sustainability report around this time that he considered extreme weather to be one of the ways that the company could be potentially harmed by global temperature rise. And so, there's, like in Australia, there's a huge disconnect between what the company knew and was saying internally, and then what its media outlets were presenting to the public.
There's a parallel to this that is pretty front of mind, which is the difference between what Fox News and other News Corp publications and broadcasting and different stations have told their listeners on the COVID-19 vaccine and what they're making their staff do. Did that comparison come up when you were writing this?
I didn't look specifically at that comparison, but some people who've responded to the article have spoken about that, and I think that's a totally worthwhile comparison.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Of course, News Corp as a company has a kind of set direction, executives set priorities and do things like this. But as a media company, it's expected to give airtime to a variety of views. And so, it's not like, I guess, necessarily contradictory for the company to broadcast things that go against what the executives are doing. And in fact, people would argue that's probably a good thing. Do you kind of see this as like, oh, this is just, part of the, beautiful, the workings of the free press? Or do you really see this as a kind of act of sheer hypocrisy?
Well, I mean, I think you do raise an important point. We don't necessarily want the owners of companies to be dictating what outlets will cover or won't cover. But on the other hand, when it comes to something like the climate emergency, you can make a fair point that pushing the type of denial that News Corp outlets have pushed benefits a certain subset of very powerful people in society, such as the owners of coal oil and gas companies, and it's creating a real public harm in terms of people not knowing the true reasons why there are these massive disasters that are claiming lives. And we've seen actually instances in the history of News Corp when Rupert Murdoch at the top set a priority, and then that actually influenced how some of his outlets covered the story. So in like the 2006, 2007 era, there were papers in Australia who responded to Murdoch taking climate change more seriously by devoting actual constructive coverage to the issue. We saw that also in New York with outlets like the New York Post. And so I think, at the end of the day, media outlets exist to inform and to serve the public and not to actively cause them harm. And so I think on an issue like climate change, we do need outlets to cover it much more constructively than a lot of News Corp outlets have been doing.
Yeah, and I think the pushback to this idea that there's it's just one voice out of the many of the opinions that are presented is, if you're watching these top hosts, the Tucker Carlsons, the Andrew Bolts in Australia, you're not getting a variety of perspectives. Andrew Bolt isn't bringing on someone who is a climate change denier and then bringing on someone who's like, we should blow up every, oil pipeline or something, far, I guess, environmentalist. It really kind of is one editorial perspective that seems to come out of the top. And that is due to the fact that, like this kind of stuff appears to serve the network and its goal of bringing in viewers and keeping them engaged very, very well. So, I mean, this is grim. I think often these conversations that we have about News Corp and its influence and some of these areas can end up being a bit depressing. What do you think is going to happen from here, Geoff? You've looked at now 15 years of changing perspectives from the company, and the way you kind of laid out is that actually, Rupert Murdoch was probably more active and more vocal about it earlier on, as kind of stepped back and has been unable, or at least unwilling, to reel in his on-air personalities. Where do you see things going from here?
I mean, it's really hard to say, but something that I found super interesting to see was some of News Corp's Australian outlets now committing to cover climate change in a much more constructive way leading up to the Glasgow climate talks later this fall. And that seemed to come about pretty suddenly, but I think it reflects the fact that public opinion on climate change, despite the best efforts of people and outlets that spread disinformation, is really changing in some fundamental ways and very fast. We've seen here in the U.S. it was a summer of record wildfires and then hurricanes on the East Coast, and so huge numbers of people who never really thought too hard about what climate change could mean for them are now, literally having their basements flooded or houses being burned down, and it's simply not tenable anymore to spread the idea that these events have no relation to the oil, gas, and coal that we're burning. And so News Corp is always going to be sort of at the back of the pack in terms of what its outlets are pushing, but it doesn't need to be, as we're seeing with this slight green rebrand in Australia now. And some commentators have responded to that by saying, if this is truly serious, then we need to see Fox News change its tune. We need to see other outlets, and I'm not quite sure that it will progress to that extent. But if anything else, it shows the people who run these companies, they know public opinion, and they can definitely see that it's changing.
Yeah, it's we've spoken about that that announcement, and we were pretty pessimistic about it. But I mean, I guess the grim like silver lining is that you can't just deny climate change anymore, and that's unfortunate because the reality of what we have here. But at least we're seeing some action, even if it is minor. Geoff, if people wanted to see more of your reporting, what's the best way to find you online?
Probably just to go to my Twitter by Googling Geoff Dembicki.
Great. Yeah, we'll pop that in the show notes as well. Geoff, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
That was US-based reporter Geoff Dembicki. You can find him on Twitter at Geoff Dembicki, which is at GeoffDembicki. All right, that is us for this week again. Just your standard kind of housekeeping stuff. If you like this, if you even, tolerate this podcast, but there's someone in your life who you think would enjoy it, please pass it on. We're just trying to use word of mouth to expand and spread the good word about News Corp and all its dealings.
That's right, and you can please, Jeffrey, join our Facebook page. It's Murdocracy on Facebook, MURDOCRACY. Lots of discussion already. We post up all kinds of articles over there from News Corp, from other people analyzing News Corp, and lots of discussions already kind of started. And it's a fun place that we're developing into a community, and we're looking forward to seeing you there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Sami, good luck for Jess's podcast this week.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about it.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.